Previously in Hedge Knights, the ruin-delving trio painstakingly proceeded through the infested ruin, clearing each room one by one. They finally breached the final door, dispatching the last remaining defenders, and found a curious-looking metal box situated in the center of the room. Tangier went into labor during a heavy acidic smog, complicating the birth, but with Sapo's adept skill in medicine, both little baby Avaren and Tangier were well cared for. Megahoof proceeded to bake the stockpiled Mackie into rations with the help of Madsy and Dave. Then all three packed up all they could manage to carry and headed back home. Episode 44, Harrowing Homeland. Tangier was still recuperating from the birth of Avaren. Sapo had ordered bed rest, despite the fact that she already felt well enough to be on her feet. Shalbel was eager to meet his new sibling, but Sapo told him that it wasn't time yet, as Avaren and Tangier both needed to recover. He busied himself in the kitchen, worried that Sapo wasn't being truthful and something dire had happened instead. Lazarus realized his son was spiraling and went out to comfort him and reassure that everything was just fine. Jadea realized Tangier didn't have a chair for breastfeeding, as the stools they had used for Bash and Shalbel had been broken down for scrap wood. She gathered some aged timber, bison wool, and cotton for stuffing, and constructed a warm and plush armchair, far better suited for a new mother than a rigid stool. The adventure-weary trio slogged through the Rokal wetlands, burdened by an abundance of books and tomes. The marshy soil offered no aid as they sank ankle-deep each step they took. Dave no longer attempted to cover their tracks. The trio didn't have the energy or time to take such careful measures. There was an urgency to return home before the worst of winter's weather set in, so they'd take measures to avoid known enemy encampments, but time was of the essence. Tangier felt well enough to be on 2 feet and headed to the dining table for some sustenance. She thanked Jadea for the lovely armchair before wolfing down an entire loaf of bread paired with a stein of mead. Having been out of commission for a few days, she asked if Megahoof and the others were back yet. Jadea nodded her head with a look of reassurance which poorly masked her underlying worry. The two knew that winter was approaching, and trekking in bitter cold with bare trees was best to be avoided. The plan, after the barn and bison paddock was ready, was to commit to cleansing all of the ground within the inner wall of the castle, and that time had come. The boundary arboretum kept the encroaching pollution at bay, and still had plenty of purified soil around the salix trees to accommodate even more displaced pollution. Reclaiming the land meter by meter was difficult work, but carving a path towards a greener future for their young children was motivation enough to endure the pain and toil of hard labor. Shalbel finally had a chance to meet his little brother Avaren. He looked up at Lazarus and asked, "Was I really that small?" Lazarus chuckled and said, "No, kiddo, you were even smaller." Lazarus told Shalbel to sit in the new armchair and then delicately placed Avaren upon Shalbel's lap. Shalbel was beaming with pride that he became an older brother and couldn't wait to show his little brother the secret nooks of the coal mine or the lovely meadows of grass and ambrosia in which he and Bash played. The hay finally dried on the racks, ready to become the bottom mat for the barns to help cut down on the filth the bison produced. Jadea was waiting for the straw as the last step before moving the bison into their much more spacious accommodations, with the added benefit that the two paddocks were adjacent to one another to allow the herd to be symbolically together. Through the thick acrid shroud encloaking the bison glade, a flickering of color could be seen. Klein hadn't seen many auroras. They were less common a bit further south in the rise of forest, and was disappointed when they were so obscured by the smogs. Judea fetched the dry straw from the racks and laid down a thick mat inside the new barn. The straw would cut down on the moisture and mud brought in from the paddock and could easily be supplemented or replaced as needed. Soon the barn would be ready to move the beds and fodder racks. There was the question of what to do with the old barn. She would need to consult Tangier and the others for the best way to use the new space. Bash was playing outside the castle walls and spotted two separate attack parties approaching the boundary. He rushed back inside to warn the others. Bash came rushing in with haste, panic, and urgency, and Judea knew exactly what was going on. She peeked outside to the north and south and saw the raid parties mustering. She alerted the others to grab their bows and report to the front gate. Unfortunately for Shellbell, his birthday celebration would have to be postponed. Shellbell had clearly shown progress in tending crops and plants, as well as cooking, a task he wasn't particularly keen to do, but nonetheless showed talent. He'd rather be out in the paddock with the bison, and was just as iron-willed as both of his unflappable parents. Despite being outnumbered, the Adlets grabbed their weapons and quickly scarfed a meal to stave off hunger before staving off the raiders. Judea and Lazarus told the children to stay indoors. Judea rallied the archers and ordered them to the southern gate room, and Lazarus stood guard over the portcullis gates. Judea ordered the others to focus on targets who were lightly armored, so the enemy group as a whole would retreat from attrition. The colorful glow of the aurora lights shimmering behind the putrid smog had faded, and if the Adlets weren't so focused on the defense of the castle, they would have noticed, and they perhaps would have considered it as an ill omen. The raiding party rushed southward to avoid the volley of arrows, perhaps seeking out an easier breach point into the castle. Unfortunately for the ravenous monsters, the castle was well protected, and no such vulnerability would be found. Zappo and Klein wanted to relocate to the southern gatehouse to finish off the first group, but Judea told them to wait and be patient. A second party approached, and she didn't want to leave Lazarus to fend them off on his own. Her keen eyes spotted movement just beyond the western boundary, and she knew a new wave would be upon them soon. Judea's quick assessment was correct. The next group rushed towards the gate, only to be met with a vicious volley of arrows. The barrage threw them into disarray, some trying to press on forward towards Lazarus, who was visibly taunting them, while others sought cover from the arrows, hoping to breach an attack from the north. The disorganized attack of raiders, who were slowly trickling into the glade, made it easy for the Adlet archers to dispatch them. The tension and the posture of the archers visibly relaxed. While nobody had openly said they worried about being outnumbered, it was obvious that that was top of mind for the defenders. With the corpses of horrid monsters littering the marshy entry grounds, the archers realized these raid parties were too disorganized and untrained to be of any real threat to their fortified castle. While the second raid party routed, Judea told Klein and Zappo it was now time to head to the southern gatehouse and ambush the mustering raid force as they had suggested. Tangier yelled for Lazarus to be careful and shut the door if any approached and to call out for backup. The archers then sprinted across the fallow farmland to lay in wait for the final wave to approach. Their strategy paid off. The attacking party could be seen assessing their approach from the southeast corner of the glade. The archers closed the slab door as quietly as they could, and then hid from view of the arrow slits in the gatehouse. Judea peeked as the others laid in wait for her signal to draw and fire. The enemies were lightly armored and moving quickly, and trying to avoid the soft, murky swamp, drawing them ever closer to the castle walls. Judea ordered the archers to fire on whomever was in front of the assault group, so that all the enemies would be wounded and slowed, allowing for the archers to reposition towards the gate if it was needed. The second party routed, and Judea asked for help to raise the southern gate so she could finish off the retreating enemies before they broke holes in the boundary wall. Tangier yelled to Lazarus it was all clear, and then headed inside to comfort the children. Raids were an all too common occurrence in the glade, so the Adlets did all they could to reduce the psychological toll that war had on Shellbell and Bash. While the raids were completely unsuccessful, Judea worried that any surviving raiders would spread rumors that the castle and the glades were only lightly defended. Any raider paying enough attention would know their defense force was nearly halved, with Megahoof, Dave, and Madsy away traveling. Unfortunately, some of the second group had indeed escaped, and she wasn't sure if they were mortally wounded to bleed out while fleeing, or they would make it back to their encampment to plan yet another siege. The Adlets went right back to work after the attack and started to move some of the bison's beds to the new barn house. The bison's old barn house was too small to fit all of the bedding, so they were huddled together so tightly that the Adlets worried for their safety. But the new barn would allow them to rest comfortably and get out of the toxic smog. Dave was leading the trio further west to avoid the encampment they knew of near the coast. The three were finally clear of the swamp and making very good time, eager to return before the worst of winter. Just as the Adlets could not bear the toxic air any longer, it drifted out of the glade with a strong wind from the west. The sky was clear and the air was warm and comforting, especially given it was the final day of autumn. The clear air made it easier for Judea to cremate all of the corpses from the previous raid, which helped to keep her mind off of missing Megahoof and worrying that their travels were too dangerous or difficult. Tangier placed a hand on her shoulder, sensing her tension from the final day of autumn, and told her she was quite sure they'd be home soon. Knowing that winter would soon be upon them, Tangier mustered her strength and descended into the coal mines to make sure their supply of heating fuel would last. Dave had navigated them successfully around the visitor encampment, and having not run into any patrols or raiding parties, decided to head straight for the main Ryza roads. Judea couldn't sleep, too restless about her husband being missing. Despite the others trying to reassure her or remind her that the trek out to find Klein was also met with complications and delays, she couldn't set her mind at ease. She inspected some of the damage from the attacks and made some repairs to the gatehouse. She was worried a worse raid was on its way, because the last group felt like a poorly trained reconnaissance party and some escaped with the knowledge that the Adlets had many fewer bowmen than usual. The new barn was just about ready, and it was time to move the last of the beds and lead the bison to their new, far larger and more comfortable accommodation. The fungal cap fodder needed to be moved, but Lazarus and Sapo hoped that some of the bison's diets could be met with just wild grasses from the grazing lands, instead of having to continually cultivate mushrooms, which was not a particularly pleasant chore. One added benefit was that the two separated herds were now side by side. The matriarch and patriarch of the herd was still kept separated, but at least they were adjacent to one another, which felt like a far kinder way to manage the two herds. The old barn was ready for some renovations. Judea and Tangier planned to convert some of the area to a playroom and recreation room, as it felt like the children of the castle didn't really have an area to call their own, besides the secret room in the coal mine, of course. The awkward architecture of the prayer room could also be addressed, correcting the jagged and stepped walls to have the temple be more rectangular and spacious. It had been a while since the grounds of the castle had been expanded. Judea asked Tangier if she wanted to construct a new bedroom for Averin. Tangier said it wasn't necessary, as likely once Averin was old enough to be in his own bed, he'd likely want his bed to be in the same room as his sibling anyway. Then Tangier joked that maybe the trio rescued another refugee and they'd need the room for an unexpected reason. Judea laughed and said that there was plenty of room in the farmland if they needed more bedrooms. There was plenty of room on the shelves in the pantry for the hay and fungal caps, so instead of having two separated stockrooms, the builders planned to salvage the wood from the shelves near the old barn and combine everything together in the pantry. Nobody knew of any games besides horseshoes and cups and dice, and everyone was getting quite bored of both. The Adlets hoped that once Megahoof returned home, he would either know of some games already to build and set up, or he could find references for some. Worst case scenario, Megahoof could move his lab into the room and treat it like a research laboratory and library wing, two very useful things to have in a castle dedicated towards the discovering of knowledge and technology of the High Ages. The first day of winter came and went with no sign of the three adventurers. The halls of the castle were quieter without Megahoof's alchemical tinkering, Dave's boisterously told stories, or Madzie's hijinks. The Adlets had no way of knowing the trio were alive and well, heading back home as quickly as they could. And they also had no way of knowing Judea's prediction of a horde of raiders was about to come true. Thank you for tuning in to Hedge Knights episode 44, Harrowing Homeland. If you would like to join my online gaming community on Discord, a link can be found in the description of this video or at Rhadamant.com. If you would like to join any of my live streams, a link to Twitch can be found on my website as well, and also a countdown timer to upcoming streams. Thank you so very much for watching, and a special thank you to my Patreon patrons, Twitch subscribers, and viewers like you that support the channel and made it all the way to the credits. Thank you so very much. Hope to catch you next episode. Farewell, my fellow Adlets.